before that, I was a scientist, and I have a 2-year-old. So we're at a WordCamp. All you people are WordPress people, so I'm hoping that you can relate to this story. So you want to build a website. Maybe you want to build a website for an organization you volunteer with, or maybe you want to build one for a business you're starting, or maybe you want to build one for a friend or family member. So you kind of research your options and you discover WordPress. So you think, okay, I'm going to give this a try. So you do a lot of Googling and you kind of figure things out, and suddenly you've built your first website. And it's really great and you're really proud of it, except that there's one thing that it can't do. Maybe you want it to have user-submitted forms. Maybe you want it to manage your events. Maybe you want it to be an e-commerce site. So back to Google, you discover, much to your delight, that there's a plugin for that. Or maybe there are 10 plugins for that. And that's really the beauty of WordPress. It's this big open source project, and there are a lot of people contributing to it. And there are tens of thousands of free plugins that help you extend the functionality of WordPress in so many different ways. So you go on your way, you continue building sites, you're getting better at it, maybe you're even getting paid for it, maybe you're at an agency now, maybe you're a freelancer and you're learning how to build themes, maybe you're building your own custom themes or child themes, you're getting really good at HTML, CSS, JavaScript, PHP. You're learning the WordPress way of doing things. So things are going really well until one day you're building a site and you want it to do something and you discover, much to your shock, that there's not a plugin for that. Or maybe there is a plugin for that and it hasn't been updated in 5 years. Or maybe there's a plugin for that and it just doesn't work the way that you want it to work. So you think, well, I'm kind of far along the journey. I'm pretty comfortable as a developer. Maybe I can build my own plugin. So I found myself in that situation about a year ago. And today I'm going to talk about 8 lessons that I learned in the process of building and releasing my first WordPress plugin on the WordPress.org plugin repo. So the first lesson is scratch your own itch. So when you're thinking about what kind of plugin you want to build, think about something that is a pain point for you, or something that if you built it, you would want to use it, and it would actually help you in some way. This will help you feel invested in the project. So what was the itch that I was trying to scratch? It can be summarized as, dude, why did I install this plugin? So going back to when I was a developer at an agency, we maintained and built a lot of websites for small businesses and nonprofits. And I would often find myself working on a site, and I would open the plugins page, and I would see a particular plugin and think, I have no idea why this plugin is installed. Like, I wasn't the one who built this, so I don't know what it does. I don't know if I can update it, or if it's safe to update it, and if I do, how should I test? Where should I look to make sure it hasn't broken something? So, to be fair, we had some documentation in Evernote, but it wasn't always easy to find that documentation for a particular plugin. So I thought, wouldn't it be nice to have plugin notes? So the way I envisioned it, so we're looking at the familiar plugins page that we've probably all seen. And so you have the column with the plugin name and the description. But what I thought would be really nice would be to have a third column with plugin notes. And you could add as few or as many notes for each plugin as you want. So in this particular example, the one that I've blown up here, you have, say, an informational note that says what the plugin does, and you can have a link note that links to where this plugin came from on GitHub. Or you can have an alert note, like, don't update this plugin because the code is hacked, even though I don't recommend that you do that. So first I did some research. There are like more than 50,000 plugins available for WordPress, so you want to make sure that you're not reinventing the wheel. So it turns out that there was an existing plugin notes plugin However, it hadn't been updated in 5 years, and I didn't do things the way that I was hoping for things to be done. So I found this to be a good opportunity to build something and contribute to the community, something that I would find useful and hopefully others would find useful as well. So I thought, okay, let's do this. So when I get into a project like this, and especially building a plugin that I'm going to offer on the WordPress repo, I want to be really thorough, and I want to make sure I cover all my bases. So, so what should you consider when building a plugin? So I'm going to talk about a few of these things you should consider, divided into 4 main areas. This isn't exhaustive, but these are a lot of things you need to think about. So for tools and techniques, for example, you might want to think about building your plugin with object-oriented programming in PHP. This is what a lot of people are using these days for building plugins, and there are good reasons for using it. It helps you organize your code, and it prevents you from, or makes it a lot less likely that your code is going to conflict with somebody else's code running on somebody's site. Then you got to think about the actions and filters. So what do you need to hook into in WordPress for your plugin to work? Then you maybe think about using Jquery and Ajax. So you want to make a really smooth user interface. Then you want to think about version control. So you might be comfortable tracking things with Git. You might start a Git repo for your project. But you also got to keep in mind that the WordPress repo is actually tracked using a different version control system called Subversion. So you might want to know something about that. And then you could get fancy with your tooling, like use Xdebug for your PHP debugging, and you could do linting with something like PHP Code Sniffer. Okay, so then we get into security considerations. So you need to think about user capabilities. So at what level does a user need to be in order to access the functionality of your plugin? Data validation, data sanitization. So if you have a user entering data that's going to go in your database, you need to be careful and make sure that you handle it in a way that you're not going to put something in your database that's going to break something. And then you need to think about nonces. So if basically this is a mechanism where before you save something to your database, you confirm that it was actually coming from the form that you were expecting it to come from. Then you've got data handling. So you need to think about how are you going to store the data for your plugin. Are you going to store it in an existing table, or are you going to make a custom table? Then you need to think about safe database queries. If you have a custom table or any kind of database query, you want to make sure that that's safe and you're not exposing yourself to a SQL injection. And then you got to think about the API maybe. So now there's the WordPress API, so maybe you want to extend it with data that's coming from your plugin. And then there's even more to think about. So you want to think about how is your plugin going to work with multi-site. There was a great talk before this about accessibility. So you want to make sure anything you build is going to be accessible. And then you need to think about, this stands for internationalization. So if you have any strings you're displaying to your user, you want to make sure that somebody can translate them into their language. And finally, you want to make sure that it works on different operating systems. So if I've lost anybody at this point, don't worry. So this was kind of my reaction to after all this reading. Like this time, I'm not sure if I can do this. This seemed like a really big responsibility to build a plugin that hundreds or thousands of people might install on their site. So this brings us to lesson 2. So I'm an avid podcast listener, and I listen to one of the podcasts that I like to listen to is called Hallway Chats. And so around the time I was thinking about building this plugin, I listened to an episode of Hallway Chats where somebody gave the piece of advice: if it's worth doing, it's worth doing badly. So I'm not giving you all permission to go and make a bad plugin and do a bad job. But what it meant to me was that as somebody with perfectionistic tendencies, it kind of gave me the permission to say, okay, it's worth doing. I find this to be something that I want to build, that I would use. So I'm going to give myself permission to make mistakes, if that so happens. So I stepped back and I thought, okay, let's take this one step at a time. What's the first thing that I need to do to make this plugin work? So the first step would be adding a new column to the plugins table. So how did I do that? So the first thing is I knew about another plugin that did something similar. So I went into their code and I discovered that they were using a couple of hooks that allow you to add a custom column to the plugins table. So then I found documentation on how to use the hooks, and I was able to use that to build an extremely simple plugin that just adds this column, and I echoed the string plugin note goes here for every plugin. So it's not done, but it was kind of a foothold that gave me the confidence to say, okay, what's the next step after this? What's the next step after that? So lesson 3, this is something that I heard a professor say on the first day of class in college. And I don't really remember a lot else from that class, but this stuck with me. If you're not uncomfortable, you're not learning. So if you're building your first plugin, and this was definitely the case for me, there were times that I was uncomfortable, that I was doing things that I didn't know how to do, trying to figure things out. But in the end, it's a really good learning experience. So the good news is that you're not going to be in this alone. There are tons of resources out there about best practices for building plugins, best practices for WordPress development in general. So the 2 that I want to highlight are knowthecode.io and WP Sessions. The reason that I'm highlighting those 2 is because they have really good video tutorials that take you through the process of building a plugin from start to finish. And the way that I like to learn, I like to kind of feel like I'm looking over the shoulder of somebody who's a few steps ahead of me, and then I can kind of see how they do things and emulate them. And then there are a number of other resources. So you're going to want to bookmark the WordPress Plugins Handbook. There are a couple of blogs that have a lot of good content for plugin developers, Pippin's Plugins and Delicious Brains. Also, there are a ton of open source WordPress plugins. So if you know of something that does something similar to what you're trying to do, look at their code and see how they do it, and you don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel. Obviously, you have Google and Stack Overflow at your disposal, and you can reach out to somebody on Slack. So going back to the big scary 4-quadrant diagram, all the things you need to think about, I just wanted to highlight how I addressed a few of these. So you can cut out the pieces that you don't need for your plugin, but it's a really good foundation. Then we get to Jquery and Ajax. So I wanted to have a really smooth interface where people could add, edit, delete notes without having to refresh the page. So that's where Ajax really comes in handy. So you can kind of see how that works in this video. And if you want to learn more about it, there's a good reference in the WordPress plugin handbook. Now, as far as security, so the first thing I thought about was user capability. So to me, it made the most sense that the only way to see plugin notes and add or edit plugin notes was if a user could activate plugins. So I wrapped all the markup for plugin notes and the plugin form in that conditional, so that if somebody has a lower user role, they're not even going to see it. So as far as data validation and sanitization, the plugin actually allows users to include specific HTML tags in their plugin notes. So there's a handy function called WP Kisses, which stands for Strip Evil Scripts, and it basically allows you to whitelist specific HTML tags, but prevent them from using like a script tag or something that they could potentially inject something in the database that could be malicious. And finally, to handle nonces, there are some very convenient functions, WP create nonce, and because I'm using Ajax, I used a function called check Ajax refer before actually saving the plugin note to the database, and that basically just allows you to confirm that the plugin note is actually coming from the form that you type the plugin note into. All right, so now data handling and data storage. I was actually tempted to store the plugin notes in the options table because I had seen other plugins do things like this, and it's just a really convenient API where it's just like add option, edit option. But that's actually not probably a good idea. So the options table is really just for small amounts of data that are options. So what I ended up doing ultimately was making a custom table. And then I used WordPress's built-in helper functions to perform safe database queries. Now, for internationalization, if you've ever looked at a WordPress theme or plugin, you might have seen these functions, double underscore, underscore E, or the escape HTML versions of those. These basically allow you to mark strings that your plugin is putting out so that people can provide translations of those strings. So for example, my plugin has a string that says add plugin or edit plugin no. So if I route them in these functions, then somebody can come and provide a translation. So if your WordPress install is in Spanish and there's a Spanish translation provided, they can see the Spanish version of that. Now, how did I handle multi-site? So there were a couple of different ways that I could have gone on this. I could have either said every single site in this whole multi-site install is going to have synced plugin notes, so always see the same ones. Or I could have each site maintain its own. So to me, it made more sense to have each site maintain its own plugin notes because different sites in a multi-site install can activate different plugins. So that's the way I went. And I also discovered when testing my site testing the plugin for multi-site that there are actually additional hooks that I needed to use that allowed me to display the plugin notes column on the super admin plugins page, and those are shown there. So after all that work, there came a day that the plugin was working. So you might think, okay, now it's time to release it on the repository. But that's not the next step. So lesson 4 is test, test, and test some more. So how should you test your plugin? So there are the basic things, like does the plugin do what you want it to do? And does it not do the things that you don't want it to do? But there are also other things that are important to think about. So when you're developing your plugin, you might have a local install. You're probably the admin user on that, or the admin on that local install. So you might not have tested other user roles. So now is a really good time to create additional accounts that have role of, say, author or subscriber, and make sure that they see or don't see things as you would expect. Also, if you're familiar with building websites, you probably test in different browsers. So you probably want to do the same thing with your plugin. My plugin, Nose plugin, had extremely minimal CSS, but when I tested it in Edge, I found out that the plugin notes column was way too wide. So fortunately, I tested in Edge and I was able to fix that before I released it. Also, you want to test on different operating systems. So a lot of servers are Linux, but some are Windows. And I actually failed to test in Windows, and it came back to bite me, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. So then you also want to create a multi-site install and test on that and make sure it's working how you expect. I actually even tested by providing a Spanish translation of my plugin to make sure that was working. And I tested for accessibility. So another thing you want to do, if at all possible, is ask other people to test. And you're not looking for people to compliment you or say you made a good plugin. You really want people to test edge cases and try to break your plugin. Use it in ways that maybe you weren't expecting. And unfortunately, you can't read that whole thing, but it says consider bribery. So I was working with an agency at the time, and we used a system called Bonusly. So at the beginning of every month, you get like 50 points, and you're allowed to give them to your coworkers as you see fit. So I came up with a point system where if they install my plugin and tested it a little bit, they would get 1 point. But if they found a bug, they would get 10 points. All right, so the day came that it was time to release it to the world. So you might be wondering, what's the process for submitting a plugin to the repo? So it's actually pretty simple. You basically provide your plugin as a zip file, and you upload it to that URL. Now, one thing you're going to want to think about, though, is that when you submit your plugin for the review process, you're going to be assigned a unique slug that's derived from the plugin name. The plugin name is what you're going to have in the header of your main plugin file. So you want to go into the WordPress plugin repo before that and make sure you have a unique name so that you get a unique slug. Something to note about the review process is that the plugin reviewers will check for common errors and guideline adherence. They're not going to install your plugin and actually test it and make sure it's doing what you say it's going to do. So that's why that testing process is so important. So once the plugin is approved, they'll provide you links in the email about how to use Subversion. So I'm by no means an expert in Subversion, but that link gave me just enough information to be able to get it on the repo and push updates. Also, they're going to say how to structure your readme.txt file. This is important because that's going to translate to how your plugin displays in the plugin repo. And they'll instruct you how to make your plugin assets, which are the banner that you see with the plugin and the icon. So this is the final product in the plugin repo. The plugin's name is Plugin Notes Plus because Plugin Notes was already taken. So this was a really gratifying experience to see that I built a plugin, it was in the repo, people were actually starting to use it. So time passed, I was getting more users, I even got some positive reviews and that was really great. But beware lesson 5. Bugs will surface at the worst possible times. Remain calm, it's going to be okay. All right, so I have a funny story about that. So it had been about a month since I published my plugin on the WordPress repo. And I had, I think, about 50 active installs at the time, and that was really exciting to me. It was a Friday afternoon, it was my birthday, and I got an email saying that I had a support request for my plugin. So I read the email and I discovered that a user told me, I'm using your plugin, it's great, except that I'm randomly losing notes, like they're just disappearing. So I thought, okay, this is a problem. Like I have 50 people using this plugin, I don't want them to be losing notes, and I don't know why that's happening. I obviously had never seen that in testing. So I immediately wanted to kind of figure out what's going on and try to fix it and make sure it didn't happen to anybody else. The problem was that the next day was my daughter's birthday, and she was turning 2, and I had promised to bake her cupcakes. So I was kind of in the predicament: do I address the support request right now, or do I make cupcakes? So if anybody knows a 2-year-old, you know the answer to this. You make the cupcakes first. So then over the next few days, I was able to kind of go back and forth with the user and understand kind of what other plugins he had installed, what his site was running on. And so you're probably, cupcakes first. So you're probably wondering what went wrong. So in order to understand that, I'll explain that in order to link a plugin note to a specific plugin, I was using an ID for that plugin in the database that was derived from the file path to the plugin main file. And I think that's a pretty legitimate way to do it. The problem was that it turns out that the user who was experiencing the problem was hosting his WordPress install on Rackspace on a Windows server. And there's a discrepancy between how a Linux server and a Windows server will give a file path. So I think it's actually a little bit more complicated than that, but the ultimate solution was that I had failed to use WP normalized path to make there be consistency between operating systems and file paths. Fortunately, I was able to release this update. The user was able to get his plugin notes back because they weren't actually deleted from the database. It was just the plugin wasn't able to find them because they were at the wrong file path. So that is all to say that you're going to make mistakes. Treat them as learning opportunities. And I've definitely learned a lot. I learned a lot building the plugin, and I've learned a lot supporting the plugin. The next lesson, however, is you're not going to be able to please everyone. So there are going to be people who want you to make your plugin do something that you don't really think it should do, or it's just something that you don't envision for the plugin. Or maybe they're going to have a request that you think is really reasonable, but you just don't have time. So that's the beauty of having an open source license on your plugin. So my plugin is in GitHub. People are welcome to make pull requests or to fork it if they see a different direction that they want to take it. So just a few reflections from this process. It wasn't an easy process, but I think it was really worth it. I think in the last year, at least, it was the single most effective activity to help me grow as a developer. And I found it really gratifying to give back to the community that I feel like I've gotten so much from in the last few years learning development. And finally, I found it pretty validating to be able to release a plugin as a new developer, and it's kind of a good cure for imposter syndrome. So this is the final lesson, and it's about prerequisites for building a plugin. A lot of people might think you have to have a degree in computer science, or you have to have 20 years experience coding, but I really think you only need 3 things. A good idea for a plugin, the desire to learn to build a plugin, and the time to do it well. So if anybody listens to the Shop Talk show, this is derived from their advice: just build websites, just build plugins. So that's all I have. You can reach me on email. I'm sometimes on Twitter, or you can check out my blog. I don't have a lot of time to blog because my hands are literally full of a 2-year-old. And that's it. And I just wanted to also mention that if you want to work directly with me, we have an opening at Stanford Law School for a UX and content manager.
We have time for a few questions. Anybody have questions about plugins or building a plugin? Want to get started building a plugin? All right.
Are you building another one?
Yeah. Actually, I have one that I haven't released on the GitHub or on the WordPress repo, but it's on GitHub. It's for user meeting times if you're in different time zones to kind of calculate everybody's time zone. I have some ideas for other plugins, but I have a lot going on right now too.
Totally understand. Another?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, how long was the process from the start of you wanting to do the plugin to when you actually release it to the repo?
I think I started working on it last November, and I think I released it in February. If I had spent full time, this was like a side project, so I could have done it faster, but I think that was about the time frame.
All right. Oh, go ahead.
Are there any common debugging issues you run into while developing the plugin? Things that different from like debugging a WordPress theme or a page or anything that were kind of sticking points for you? Or tips on how to debug plugins that you came across while you're doing this?
Well, I guess my biggest tip is to use Debug, and I'm guessing it would be helpful more in the context of a plugin than a theme. But yeah, I mean, Debug is great because you can see it. You can step through your code and see exactly where it is. You can see, what variables, what their values are at that particular time. So yeah, I would definitely recommend if you've heard of Debug and you're thinking about getting into plugin development, that's definitely something to look into.
Cool, thanks.
One more in the back.
Did you do anything to promote your plugin or just put it on the repository?
Nothing, no. And in fact,
She's here.
Well, yeah.
Wow. That's it.
I guess I didn't really want a ton of users to begin with because I You know, I'd rather have 50 users when something breaks than 500. Yeah.
Good
But
point.
now that it's functioning and you have 400 users, that's awesome.
Yeah.
You're asking.
Thanks.
One more, go ahead.
Use the pro version coming up.
Soon, no, I don't know.
When she's 5.
I don't envision a pro version. If somebody wants to fork it and make a pro version, they're welcome to. But I see this as my contribution to the WordPress community. Yeah.
Okay, that's great, Jamie. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming.